Tests sound good?
Thank you guys for staying this morning for Living Faith. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alex K. She told me to call her Dr. K. I'm going to take her up on that. This is the beginning of a study of world religions. We're kicking it off with Buddhism, and we hope to find a local temple that we can later go and visit. We'll also be moving on to Islam and Judaism in the winter and spring. And this all kind of started with one of our adult classes who started with a book study looking into the things that we could be envious about in other religions, and got curious about learning some more, and that's what led us to this moment. So we're going to kick off our presentation with Buddhism. Thank you, Dr. K.
Thank you all for having me. This is a beautiful space. It's really nice to be with you here. So I should stand. Where's good to stand? Oh, right here? Okay. Well, yeah, so I'm Alex Kaloyanides. The students, they call me Dr. K. It's a lot easier. You guys can just call me Alex. It's fine. I am a professor of Asian religions right across the street at UNC Charlotte. I've been here for 5 years. I really enjoy being here. The students, I'm sure you know many of them. They're wonderful, and it's a great place to teach and work. And we've got some other colleagues who specialize in these other religions too, so I'm sure they'd be happy to come and talk to you. So today, I just wanted to say a few things really by way of introduction to Buddhism, and I'm here to sort of answer questions as well. So if there are certain kinds of things that I don't cover, I hope that you'll be able to ask those questions and I can do my best to answer them. I wanted to just start by just asking you, when you see the word Buddhism, what comes to mind? What are some ideas that you have when you think of Buddhism? Yeah. The Buddha statue, the actual physical, and you see the seated one, the one where you're sort of seated in meditation. I'll show you some of those. What else do you think of? Meditation, yes. That's sort of the most famous thing, I think, especially in the West, about Buddhism is the meditation tradition of focusing the mind, cultivating wisdom and compassion. Any other thoughts that come to mind? Peace, yeah, very peaceful. It has a reputation of being a very peaceful world religion, and even when we have certain historical events like what was happening in Myanmar, of course there are exceptions to that, but it is very much a religion of peace. I became very interested in studying Buddhism when I was in college. I went to college in New York. I was telling this to Carol, I really liked Indian food. I just happened to like Indian food, so I took a class. on the introduction to Indian civilizations. And this was my first year in college, and I started to learn about Indian traditions, and then I learned about Buddhism and became very interested. And I ended up studying in India for a year. I lived in Buddhist monasteries, and after college, I worked for a Buddhist magazine and became really interested in the history of Buddhism, and that's why I wanted to go back to school, to go to graduate school, to learn more of the history and learn the languages and study Buddhism in a sort of more professional way. And so I did my PhD in Asian religions and graduated, spent a couple years in California, and now I'm here. So what I want to do is give some sort of background. Who was the Buddha and what did he teach? Some of these sort of basic foundations of the tradition. So here you could see this is a painting of the Buddha. He's actually holding a bowl there, a little different, and he's on a lotus throne. You'll often see the Buddha with a halo around, sort of marking the Buddha as a halo, and you always see him in his monastic robes, which you see here. And he has there are these special marks on his body that you'll see. There are these sort of special marks that all Buddhas are said to have. And one of them will be a certain kind of sometimes it looks like a third eye, but really it will just be like, sometimes it's a tuft of light. It's different in the different traditions. And there's also this distinct shape to his head. You'll see how there's this sort of shape, there's almost like a little bump on his head. Those are the special marks of the Buddha, and we'll see different versions of him here. So to understand Buddhism, I think it's really important to understand India, South Asia, where the Buddha was born and taught. So here on this map, you could see the subcontinent, and you could see that it's a very distinct cultural area for several millennia, and it's because of geographical reasons. So what do you notice about the subcontinent? Even just looking at the map? Yeah, you have the mountains to the north. Maybe this actually works. Yeah, you have the mountains to the north, and then all of the water to the south. So it's very much, and the mountains, those are the highest mountains in the world, right? The Himalayas. So because of that, you have this very distinct place, a place that has had a sort of a distinctive culture. It has the Indian Ocean to the south, and you get these fertile plains. So from the glaciers coming from the mountains, the rivers flow down into the north, and you have these very rich plains. And so what that has meant for the Indian renouncer tradition, of which the Buddha was one, is that because there was these rich, this farming community, this is 500 years before the time of Christ, India had a surplus of grain. It had enough food that it could feed everybody and more, that not everyone needed to work, basically. So there was the invention of iron tools and so on, and the society became rather comfortable, well off, and this meant that some people could stop working and depend on alms, charity from others. So around the 5th century, the time of the Buddha, it wasn't just the Buddha, but many other seekers, religious people, who decided, I don't want to just live this life anymore. I don't want to just work in the fields or be a tradesperson. I also don't know what I think about the religion at the time is known as the Vedas, were these religious texts, so sort of the ancestors of Hinduism. And they were run by these priests who said the society was naturally organized with the priests on the top and the workers below, and that was how everything was and always would be. But you had some people who started saying, I'm not sure that that's right. I don't know. I want to find out for myself. I'm going to give up mainstream society. I'm going to give up my family. I'm going to leave my family. I'm going to leave my job, and I'm going to live this other sort of countercultural lifestyle. And society established a path for that. Those people could do that, and they would go around, and they would depend on others' generosity for food and shelter, and they would pursue these journeys of their own. They would end up in the woods. Maybe they would practice different kinds of meditation and yoga, trying to figure out what was true about the world, what was true about gods, what was true about the soul, these kinds of questions. Sorry, these are very, very small text, but basically the idea of these renouncers, these people, was they would give up their normal role in society, they're members of a household, they would abandon these conventional means of work and so on, and they would depend on donations, and the Buddha became one of these people. Now, what was really important at this time were these practices of what we call austerities. People thought, what will happen if I can start fasting? What if I can see how little food my body needs to survive? What about clothing? There was a lot of experimentation. My students always love this part, but a lot of experimentation with nakedness, like why do we wear clothing? What do we need clothing for? What is it protecting us? What do we realize the truth of ourselves and the world when we're totally naked? So there were these practices of nakedness, of fasting, and they would hone these contemplative techniques, different ways of really focusing the mind and the body in order to get these different states of consciousness. So practicing, focusing, maybe just looking at a single candle flame for hours, and get into these altered states and start exploring the world from these different kinds of mind states. And these were the kinds of practices happening in ancient India. And the idea wasn't just to see sort of like to have bizarre experiences. The idea was that you could have new understandings of the world and of the self, of relationships, of freedom. So the point of these kinds of practices was to come up with new philosophies. People were dissatisfied with the religious teachings of their day, and they thought if they could enter into these different mind states, they could start having new revelations. So the Buddha was one of these renouncers. Here you could see him again, so you'll notice this distinctive shape of his head. He's got the halo. This is a sculpture from an ancient kingdom of Gandhara, which is actually now a sort of Pakistan, Afghanistan region. And there was some influence. There was connections with the Mediterranean through trade. So some of you who might be familiar with ancient Greco-Roman sculpture, you'll recognize some of the influence here. He's wearing his robes. He's seated in his meditation posture on his throne. And again, you can see the halo behind him. So he was an Indian prince. He was born on the Nepalese border around 500 to 400. We don't know the exact date, but 500 to 400 BCE. He was born as a prince, and his family was well-to-do. And when he was born, he had these marks on his body. Traditionally, they say there are 32 marks, including wheels on the bottom of the feet, chakras, and webbed fingers and toes. So you can imagine this baby's born, and they say, oh, wow, look at this, extraordinary baby. So they call the priests and so on to come and look at this baby. And the priests come, and they're all excited, and they say, oh, yes, this baby is wonderful and is going to have a wonderful life. There are two possibilities for your baby, to the king and the queen. One, they're going to be a world ruler, a great, like you are a king, but they're going to even run the whole world. He'll be the great king of the world. Or he's going to be a religious renouncer. And you can imagine the father was like, no, that sounds like a really hard life. I don't want him to go off and be naked in the forest. I'd much rather him do the family business and become a great, rich, powerful king. So he decides to make the kingdom so wonderful that his son will never want to leave. He fills it with beautiful people, wonderful music, delicious foods. The prince is trained in everything. He learns art and he learns, wrestling. He learns to read and write multiple languages. He has the best tutors in the world. He lives this wonderful life. He gets married. He has a child. But one day, and he's never left the grounds, and one day the prince is sitting there, and the story goes that he hears in the distance a song, a woman singing over some kind of stringed instrument. And she's singing of the beautiful lands and the countryside. She's singing of the birds and the trees, and he realizes he's never even seen that. He's never left. Isn't that strange? I've never left. He comes to this realization, so he says to his father, I'd like to go off and explore and see what the world is like. And his father's like, oh man, I knew this was coming. So he's like, okay, sure, of course, yes, of course you should see. So he arranges a trip out to a pleasure garden, sort of a park. And so he says, okay, sure, yes, we'll do it tomorrow. And then he goes and he tells all his ministers, Okay, hide all the sick people, hide all the old people, make it just look really nice, no signs of poverty, like just have all, it's like when you see the Super Bowl and they always have like the most young, attractive people in the front, it's like a version of that. They just get all the good-looking people, they make the buildings look nice, and the prince finally is able to leave and process, and all the people come because they've heard about this wonderful prince. So they all come to see him processing through, and they see that, he's there, and he says, oh, this is wonderful, everyone loves me. But then, now there are different versions of the story. So this is one myth about Buddhism, that there are no gods in Buddhism. But actually there are lots of gods. There just isn't one single creator god. So there are these different gods who are always getting involved in different parts of the story. And the gods, according to this version, want the Buddha to go off and become a religious person so they can hear his teachings, so they can benefit also from his teachings. So they end up making 4 visions appear for the Buddha. The first is a vision of an old person. For the first time in his life, the story goes, the Buddha sees an elderly person who's bent over and has bad vision and seems in pain. And the Buddha asks his charioteer, who is this? What is this? And he says, it's old age. This happens to all of us. All of us get old. If we're lucky to live that long, this is what will happen. And he says, oh, wow, will it happen to me? And they say, yes, to you too. And the Buddha apparently is very distraught of this news. And then he sees a sick person, someone whose belly is distended from some kind of disease, and he's all ill, and he's crying out. And again, the prince asks the same question. What is this? What is this condition? They said that sickness. Everybody falls ill at least once in their life. And the Buddha says, I will too. These people are suffering. All of a sudden, his whole world starts to fall apart, crumble. Then he sees a corpse, and it's being prepared. They do cremation at the riverside, and they're wrapping the body. They're getting the body ready to be burned. And he sees this cremation, and he sees death. It's the first time he understands that he will also die. So these are the 3 visions, and then remember I said there's a 4th one. So this is all devastating to the Buddha, whose life has been so wonderful and sheltered. Now he realizes that he's going to suffer, that everyone suffers. All the people he loves will grow old and die. And then he sees one of these renouncers. He sees a mendicant sitting, someone who's given up the pleasures of life. And he realizes there's another way, that is a path that he too can follow. So he goes back to the palace. He looks around, he sees all of these signs. The idea is he actually goes to the women's quarters where there's all these women who have been dancing and performing all night, and they've all passed out because the gods, I guess, put a little spell on them. So instead of looking wonderful and dancing and everything, they're just kind of like drooling on the floor. And he says, oh my gosh, this is a nightmare, this life I've been living, it's kind of like you go to a good party, but then it's like the end of the night of the party, it's like, oh no, this is not where it's at. This is not happiness. There's going to be so much suffering in this world. All of these people are going to suffer. They're living like there's no consequences to their actions. They don't know they're going to get old. I can't do this. So in the middle of the night, he leaves, and he goes off into the forest. He practices these austerities. He practices for 6 years, and he studies with different mendicants, people he practices. At one point, he does so much fasting. I don't know if I brought an image of the fasting. But he ends up eating 1 sesame seed, 1 jujube, and 1 grain of rice per day. So he's on a very strict diet. And they say that he could even see his spine from through his stomach. He was so thin. So he had gone from one extreme of this wealthy life to this other extreme of total denial. And he realized that wasn't the path either. A woman offers him, a cowherdess offers him a meal. He has something to eat, and he regains his strength. And that's when he's able to sit under the Bodhi tree. You've probably heard this story. He sits under the Bodhi tree, and he is able to be enlightened because he's finally found the middle way, this idea of the middle way. And the image is also of an instrument, of a stringed instrument. When the strings are too tight, it does not make a good sound. If the strings are too loose, it does not play right. You need to find some kind of balance between indulgence and denial. something, you need the strength. You need to take care of your body because your body is what's going to allow you to come to these realizations. So he spent his career, after he was enlightened under the Bodhi tree, he decides that he's going to become a teacher. Now, this was not a given. The way the tradition has it, there have been many Buddhas before this Buddha. There will be Buddhas of the future. Some Buddhas don't teach, apparently. There are some Buddhas, they're called Pratyeka Buddhas. They become enlightened, and they don't offer teachings to others. But the Buddha decided that he wanted to teach. He wanted to help others. He wanted to spread his teachings. And so he became a teacher, and he established a new religious community in northern India that flourished. There are three, so this community, this started originally in northern India, but it became a huge monastic, and I'll go through those. I'll show you a slide at the end that gives a map so you could see how it spreads. But during his lifetime, he converted kings, and he had a huge following, the story goes. Everywhere he went, people gathered all around to come and hear his message. And the tradition holds that there are these 3 jewels. This is something, if you had to take a quiz at the end of this, you say, what are the 3 jewels of Buddhism? These are the things that people take refuge in. So if you're a Buddhist, you would take a refuge in 3 things. You would take refuge in the Buddha, so the founder. So this is, and so what that means, you take this idea, this is, the Buddhist tradition holds that Siddhartha Gautama, that was his name, was fully awakened to the true nature of the cosmos and the path to total freedom from suffering. And I'll sort of break that down in a little bit. So after his enlightenment, he's called the Buddha, which means the awakened one. This Bud is this root from Sanskrit, this ancient Indian language. It means to awaken. He awakened to the reality. It's as if we're all living in a dream, and he woke up, and he saw things as they really are. So this is the first jewel of Buddhism. People take refuge, Buddhists take refuge in the Buddha. His teachings are called the Dharma. So you've probably heard this term, the Dharma. People take refuge in the teachings, the Dharma. And then the third jewel is the Sangha. So these teachings are understood to have been accurately transmitted by the monastic communities the Buddha founded, and they're known as the Sangha. So the Buddha, when he gave his teachings, and they were memorized, so it was an oral tradition for many centuries. People just recited them. The teachings were memorized. We don't have anything in writing from the time of the Buddha. So they were, and only until maybe around 500 years after the death of the Buddha did people start writing them down. So these are the idea that the Sangha, the followers, have preserved the teachings is very important for the tradition. All right, so what I thought I would do is spend a little time just kind of giving an overview of the Buddhist teachings. It'll be, a little sketchy, but it should give you a sense of sort of the core of the teachings. The Buddha famously said that what he realized on the night of his enlightenment was like a vast forest. That the extent of his enlightenment was so complicated and multifaceted. He knew all of these things, and that's why he thought maybe he would not teach. It was too much. How can all of these regular people understand what he realized? But then he decided that with just a handful of leaves, that he could just take a little bit of what he realized, and that would be enough for other people to also find freedom from suffering. That they didn't need to understand everything. There were famously a lot of questions that the Buddha would not answer. The question of, is there a God? Is there a main God? Is there a beginning of the world? When is the end of the world? Where do we come from? The Buddha said, I'm not answering those questions. They will not help you become free. What you need to know are just how suffering works. Why are you suffering? Why is there so much stress in your life? And how do you end that? That is what I'm going to teach you. That's what you should focus on. So he said, he realized he was not sure people would be ready, but he decided he would teach anyway. And there's this idea of, he thought a lot of people were not ready for the message, but that there were some people who just had, what he said, a little dust in their eyes. That there are some people that were they had the potential. They weren't totally clouded from reality. They just had a little dust in their eyes. And so out of compassion for them, for those people who could actually hear his message, he decided to teach. And so they always say that anyone who ever finds themselves in a room like this or finds themselves reading a book, by the Dalai Lama, something, that you are one of these people. You are a person who has little dust in your eyes and that you can understand the message. And famously, leaders like the Dalai Lama, say that this message is not, you could be of any religion, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, they can still listen and hear these teachings, and like the Dalai Lama says, you just become a better Christian or a better Jew or a better Muslim. So this idea wasn't necessarily this religion of exclusion. So he also said that what he wanted to teach was really for ultimate freedom, and this is the question: how do we become totally free? How do we understand where suffering comes from, and how do we make it stop? Totally cessation of suffering. The first teaching the Buddha gave is called the Four Noble Truths. How many of you have heard of this teaching, the Four Noble Truths? This is kind of, no? It's a sort of like, yeah, some of you, yeah, it's kind of, this is sort of like the one of the more famous of the teachings. It's sort of where the Buddha distilled. He gave lots of teachings. If you look at Buddhist scriptures, I mean, there are like these big stacks. There's so many teachings involved, but this is the one where he's really distilling his main teaching. These are the Four Noble Truths, and it comes from this one text where he says he's setting the wheel of the Dharma in motion. And he taught it to a group of 5 renunciants, so 5 of these people that he had practiced with in the forest before his enlightenment. So he had gone out, he was practicing with these people, he was fasting, he was practicing different forms of nakedness and doing all of this. And then, remember, he had that one meal and realized he'd gone too far. At that time, the other people were in the forest and were like, oh, he fell off. Like, he's given up, he's just eating food now. Oh no, he's given up. And so they just wrote him off. But then after his enlightenment, they saw him, and they were about to go and say, well, what happened to you? You should come back and join us. But upon seeing him and realizing that he had this realization, they immediately became his first disciples. So he taught them this first teaching. And this is where we get this idea of the middle way, something between indulgence and denial. Something that's practical. If anything, the Buddhist teaching is said to be practical, something that we can all do to find freedom in our lives. Now, the term noble truths, it's really this idea of truths that make you a noble person. So it's not so much the truths themselves that are noble, but that they, upon understanding them and realizing them, we all become more noble ourselves. So the first truth, this is what the Buddha said, is that there is suffering, that the life is suffering. And when Europeans, again, sorry this is so small to see, but this is the text itself that says, this is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. So what the Buddha means by this idea of suffering, there's this word dukkha. It's suffering in the sense of death, like we can think about suffering, but we could also translate this same word, dukkha, as stress. That there's stress in every part of our lives. This is what the Buddha said. Even sitting here now in this beautiful room, you chose to be here, but if you just kind of checked in with your body, you would feel maybe some tension. Maybe you're a little uncomfortable, a little like, how long are we here for? You've got something, even if you feel relaxed, there's some level of stress. This is what the Buddha said, that there's suffering in all of these parts of our lives. Even when we get what we want, we end up being separated from it at some point. So there's suffering in all parts of our experience. This is the first teaching. The second, I have a little cookie monster here. You saw I have my daughter, so I was just saying. The second truth is that there's craving. So this is the second part. The noble truth of the origin of suffering is this craving, which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there, that is, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for existence, craving for extermination. So what the Buddha did, and there were debates, people recognize, obviously it's not news that there's suffering in the world, but there were debates in ancient India. Where does this suffering come from? Is it just a fact of life that we all have to deal with? The Buddha said it's our relationship to things that change. We have all this craving. We want things that we like to stay that way. We want things we don't like to change. We are always wanting, and that's the problem, that it's this craving for things to be either stay the way that we like them or be different from that, and that's the problem, and that's where suffering comes from. So we all know what it is to want cookies. We all know what it is to want the weather to be different. We all know this. But this, for the Buddha, was the good news, because we could change our relationship to things in our life, that if we can get rid of the craving, that's in our control. The fact that there is disease, the fact that there is suffering is something we can't change. We can't change the whole world, but we can change our relationship to it. So this is the third truth, that there is freedom. That because suffering comes from craving, that we can then be free because we can stop the craving. So the freedom that the Buddha talked about was called, it is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and the relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. What the Buddha means here is that we can let go. Yes, we want things to be different. We want those cookies. But we can let go of that. We can learn to see that there's pain in all of that craving, and we can be free of it. We ourselves can be free of that pain. So the fourth truth, so this first is it's the diagnosis of the condition of suffering, and then the second one is realizing that suffering comes from craving. The third, that there is freedom. That's the good news. And finally, this is the path. This is what you do. So the Buddha says, for people who want to walk this path, who want this freedom, there are 8 steps. There's a lot of numbers in Buddhism. There's like all these kinds of lists. I often think it's like, magazines, you go to the store and it's like 10 ways to clean your, spring cleaning. Or I feel like it was a kind of advertising mechanism. They're like, 4 noble truths. I can only think of 3. Let me go hear what this Buddha has to say. So there's like these four noble truths, and now these are the 8-fold path. You can see I've divided them up because the first ones are things about action. The second are things having to do with meditation, and the third section are things having to do with wisdom. So the Buddha started, interestingly enough, with speech, that what we say has consequences. And if we could start there, if we could learn to speak in a way of kindness, speak truth, to speak with compassion, to not lie, that this is the first step. Be careful what you say. It has consequences. It affects other people, and it affects yourself. The next part is right action, the kinds of actions we take. So we don't kill, we don't steal, those kinds of things. So be careful what you do. First, what you say, then what you do, the actions you take in the world. And then the third one is on right livelihood. The Buddha taught that you have to live a life, not that we all have to give up our jobs and go be naked in the forest, but that we should think about how we earn our money. So the idea that you wouldn't be involved in the drug trade or arms trafficking, these were kinds of teachings that you could still make a profit. You don't have to work for a nonprofit, that you could be in business, and there were a lot of rich people who supported Buddhism, but the idea that they didn't do something that was causing harm in the world. Then there's these sections of the third, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation are different things of knowing how to have a good meditation practice. It gets a little technical, but the right effort is, you've all had friends who've gotten into meditation, right? And they're like, I do it every day, every morning. I wake up and they go too hard at the beginning, and then like a month later, they're like, oh, I couldn't keep it up. The idea is that you find some kind of balance. What is a practice you can keep up, that you can sustain? How do you do it right? How do you sort of cultivate that kind of mindfulness and that attention of meditation? And then the last 2 parts are about right view and right intention. That once you've figured out that you have a good life, that you're taking actions, you're being a kind, ethical, moral person, you earn your money in a righteous way, you've developed a meditation practice, then you start to see the world how it is. You start to understand how things really work. What is real kindness? What is real compassion? You start to see that. And what is your intention? What is it to live these truths? What is it to have the intention to help others and to become more wise in knowing yourself? This was the path that the Buddha taught would lead to enlightenment. So those were the teachings that he gave, and these teachings became very popular, and people started following him. And this is what is called the Sangha, the community. You could see here, I'm sure you've seen different Buddhist monks with different colored robes. Sometimes they're orange or maroon, cranberry, depending on the tradition. This is the Sangha that he founded. And basically, the idea was that you give up your household life. These are people who become monks or nuns, and you depend on the community at large. So monks and nuns that you see all around the world, we have them here in Charlotte, they depend on others for food, clothing, and shelter. They don't earn any money. And so they give teachings, and they depend entirely on the regular working people for their livelihood. I don't think we need to go through all this. I just thought you might be curious about what it is to become a Buddhist monk and the different rules that they practice. The first 5 are the ones that all people, so not just monks, but what they call lay people, regular people, they take it's kind of like the commandments, but these are the first, they're vows. The first is that you refrain from harming living creatures, so no killing, which extends also to bugs and other animals. Not taking what's not given, so basically not stealing. For monks, it's all sexual activity. The rule within for lay people, it just says right sexual activity, which has been interpreted. Sometimes it's monogamy, but not always, depending on the culture. Also, false speech. Again, this importance of not lying, of speaking the truth. And then the 5th one is intoxicants that cause heedlessness. So there's this idea of no drinking or different kinds of drugs. And this wasn't always the rule. At first, people used to be able to drink. Apparently, there was a kind of liquor that they liked in ancient India called pigeon's liquor. And there was this one monk who was really famous for being a really good meditator, and everyone wanted him to come visit their houses. And so they said, "Oh, if you come to my house, what can I get you?" And he was like, "Ooh, I love that pigeon liquor." And they're like, "Okay, great." So he started going around, and people were like, "Oh, he's so great. You should have him over. He's a great meditator." So he starts visiting people's houses, and he goes to one house, and he's like, drinks a little pigeon liquor. He goes to the next house, he drinks a little pigeon liquor. Like 5 houses later, he's like stumbling, and the Buddha's giving a teaching in a nice hall like this, and he passes out in the back of the hall with his feet facing the Buddha, which is very disrespectful. Like when you get a chance to visit a Buddhist temple, you would keep your feet behind. You wouldn't put the lowest part of your body. So the Buddha says, "Look at that monk. He's such a famous meditator. He can't even make it here. Look at him." So he makes a rule: no more drinking, and he extends it to lay people too. That it's really the problem is that it causes you to break the other rules. That if we all, that's also, not only does it disturb whatever kind of, concentration you might have developed from meditation, but it also could lead to harming others through the other rules. And then the rules go on for monks. They don't eat after midday, so they just have the one meal in the morning, really a big meal basically. Part of this was to sort of make their lifestyle more simple, but also because they depend on the community, right? So if you're depending for all of your meals on working people, the Buddha was like, it's too much to ask them to make you like 3 square meals a day. Like, we'll just have one meal, it will help, they can bring you the meal, that's gonna be it. So they don't eat after midday. They don't attend entertainment, so Buddhist monks and nuns aren't supposed to go to the theater or hear music. They also don't wear jewelry or perfume. Different ways of adorning the body is against the rules, a rule from sort of a simplicity. This is a strange one. It's hard to exactly know, but there was a big concern about sleeping on luxurious beds. No high beds. Apparently that was really made people very, very full of themselves. So there was a part of a rule, no beds. And then finally, handling gold or silver, no money. So no credit cards now, no Bitcoin, nothing. They're not allowed to have any kind of currency. They're supposed to live a life of total poverty, really, dependent on the community. And the rules for monks, there are 227 of them. There are a lot of these other rules that go on that they follow, but they sort of build on these main precepts. I just wanted to say something. Sometimes my students will focus so much on monks, and I think when we think of Buddhism, we think of the Buddha meditating, we think of the monastic tradition. But of course, there are all these regular, what we call lay Buddhists, who keep the tradition going. They're the people, they've been students of the Buddha and the Buddhist teachings. They're the ones who bring food to the monks, who are devoted, and there's far more of them in the world. And I just wanted to bring this slide to show examples of what lay people do. So they bring offerings. So you see here this woman holding flowers. So she's bringing offerings to a temple. You see the people dressed in white, they're doing meditation. So they have come to the monastery for a day and they'll practice meditation or do different kinds of chanting. And then you see on the top, there's the monk in the sort of ochre robes, and you see people giving them food. So that's a way that they participate in this life. And now the idea is that there are multiple lifetimes. There's rebirth, you die and you're reborn. And for lay people, the idea is that by doing these things, by living ethical lives, generous lives, helping other people practice the tradition, that they themselves eventually will be reborn and become a monk. But for now, they just want to live their life, and then they want to take care of their families, and someday, some lifetime, they will progress toward being a monk themselves and then also enlightened. This is the last slide. I just wanted to show you how Buddhism spread. So you could see there the circle in the middle. That was where the Buddha was born, on the Indian-Nepalese border. Then the Buddhist teachings moved in different directions, largely because of trade routes. So you've heard of the Silk Road that goes into East Asia. And along, with trading, merchants and monks would go together. So you would have the different teachings would follow. So Buddhism was in China already by the 1st century. Even before that, it had moved down to Sri Lanka. You see the little tear-shaped island, the bottom of India. We have evidence, inscriptions in caves and so on, that we know Sri Lanka had Buddhism by the 3rd century BCE. Then it moved into China, Southeast Asia. You could see the lines going through. Now, Korea and Japan, 4th and 6th centuries, and then Tibet, you could see there, I don't know if you can see, it's so small, but 7th century. It took a long time, 7th century, so that's a long time after the Buddha, centuries and centuries. Why do you think it took so long to get to Tibet? The mountains, exactly, because it was so hard to get over. Now we think of Tibet, we think of the Dalai Lama as this, center of Buddhism, but it was pretty late to it. And then Mongolia as well. And then by the 19th century, because of the British Empire, European colonialism, trade, travel, all of those changes, Buddhism really became a global religion. We have Buddhists in every continent now. Every major city has Buddhist centers. It's one of the most populous in terms of the actual numbers of adherents. It's also something well known. I think it's interesting that this is the first part of the series. I think we think of Buddhism in this way. It became understood in the 19th century with the academic study of religion. People started comparing Buddhism because it seems so similar to Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, with the idea of a man who lived, who gave these teachings, who resisted the main teachings of his time, really came up with sort of these teachings. And there's scriptures that we have, a kind of Bible in Buddhism. And so this idea that it sort of filled this category of world religions. Buddhism is often sort of cited as one of the major world religions in those lists. So that is all I have there. I'm happy to go back to any slides or cover anything that was confusing, or if you guys just have some questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Anything, really. I'm happy to talk more. I'm not sure if there's something you were hoping that I'd cover that I did not cover, but I'd be happy to answer any. Yes, please.
I'm curious about the idea of reincarnation.
Yeah. Yes.
So when you see someone who is not suffering, then you can say, well, they must have been very good. They got what they deserved. And when you see someone who is suffering, when you see starving people, people who are involved in war, who are suffering, you can say, they got what they deserved.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so this is, did you hear the question? The idea about reincarnation is also connected to, which I hear you saying, is this idea of karma, your actions, your consequences. So this is exactly right. So the idea is that we all continue in this cycle, this world cycle. We all get reborn and reborn and reborn into it, and the Buddha was able to break out of it by getting enlightened. But without getting enlightened, you're stuck in this cycle. And the teaching is that that it's based on your own actions. All of your actions have consequences. So when you do wholesome actions, you have wholesome consequences, unwholesome actions, unwholesome consequences. And sometimes you'll see these paintings where they describe all the different hell realms and heavenly realms. So we can be reborn in this world as another human or as an animal. We could be reborn as a god in a god realm. We could be reborn as a hungry ghost in a hell realm. And it's all determined by our actions and our and our teaching. So the idea, there's one hand, it's like you have control, but then it also means that you have to suffer the consequences of all your negative action. So part of my research, I study these Baptist missionaries who went to Burma in 1813, and they started to learn about Buddhism. And this was often one of the hardest parts of the tradition to understand. They thought this was so devastating because there was no way of salvation. There was no sort of all-powerful figure who could come in and forgive you of your sins. And this was the part of the teaching that they would really sort of point to say, well, that seems horrible that you have to suffer all of those sins. And then the Buddhists would say, it's true, this is bad, but then you still have the chance to, even once you suffer that bad karma, you could still do these good actions. And the point about how people interpret your suffering, so they'll say, oh, what good karma we all have to be here together. But then you look at people, sometimes there was a big earthquake, for example, and people would say, oh, that almost to blame the people, say that was your fault. And so it's a big debate within Buddhist communities now. How do we do this? Do we say someone is suffering and it's all their fault and they have to go on? Some people interpret the teachings that way, and others say, our goal is to be compassionate. We should help people, however we can help people, aid people. Maybe they did something bad in the past, but how can we help them? So there's opportunities for help there. But it's a good question because it's a debate that people have all the time, and especially with things like natural disasters. Is there collective? There's a debate about, is there collective karma? Does a community have a certain, or is it all individual? Yeah. So it's and. Well, right, so some people interpret it that way, but then other people say it's so complex to understand exactly how all the because sometimes you suffer the consequences in this lifetime, sometimes in another lifetime. So some people say that you can't presume, unless you're an enlightened person. This is what the Buddhist monks would say. They would say, if you're not enlightened, you can't say that you understand why that person is suffering. That's that you're sort of assuming that. But it is a question that people have about how that all works. Yeah. So Hinduism, they do have these sort of powerful gods. So the Buddha, when he criticized the Vedic tradition, which preceded Hinduism, the Hindu tradition says that people are part of this, the universe decided that there are these people that are on the top that are the priests, and then you have the warriors, and then you have the merchants, and then you have the laborers. This is the natural way that things are. And that you're born into that class, and that's what you do. And we have many gods, and so we can pray. So Hinduism is complicated, but the Buddha said, no, that's not true. This is not how things always are. We don't have to do these sacrifices to these various gods. That teaching is in the service of those Brahmin, those specialty priests. And so the Buddha criticized Hinduism for the way that it said that the world order is something that can't be changed, that it's timeless. And the Buddha said, no, all of us can move into these different ways of being through our own actions. Does that make sense? Yeah, exactly. The caste system comes from that. And the Buddha said that whatever caste, creed, race, that you can follow my teachings, which was very different from that. But you do, like I said before, there are different gods. So you might go to a Buddhist temple and see that there are different god statues that people are praying toward, that might be sort of included in there, and sort of, it might, so some people look like Hinduism, but they have these different doctrines regarding the caste system, exactly. Yeah, it's on a lunar cycle, so it's based on the full moon, half moon days. So it would be more like every 8 days, but it's called Uposatha Day. And you saw the picture I had with the people all wearing white. So on those days, you would go to the temple, you would wear white, you would maybe take more precepts. Maybe that day you wouldn't handle money or things like that, and it would sort of be like a, Yeah, so they would do a combination. So they would give what they call Dharma talks. So the monk or the nun would give a talk on suffering or a talk on craving or a talk on freedom, and then people would listen to it, and kids would be playing in the background, and then there'd be time for meditation as well, and some chanting. There's a lot of chanting in the tradition. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this term, did you hear that? Yeah, so the idea of detachment. So this is the same, you hear, to detach, you hear this sometimes if you look at, sort of Buddhist books, the idea of how do you detach. It's really this idea of freedom from craving. That what you start to do, especially in the meditation practice, so say you're like the cookie monster, and you always want cookies, you want cookies, you want cookies, and all you're trying to do is get your cookies. If you sit down and do your meditation, you start realizing, oh, there's me thinking about cookies. That's how it feels in my body when I think about cookies. What if I just watched that thought and didn't feed into it and just let it go? So all of that. Or, if you really don't want something, oh, is it going to rain? I hope it doesn't rain, so on and so on. You just notice that thought, and rather than continuing to feed into it and thinking about it, you just let it pass in your mind. And so that idea of that kind of practice, you can detach from anything that's causing you suffering, that you could have a relationship where you see it, you recognize those thoughts, but they're no longer driving your action anymore. So love is considered one of the divine abodes. There are 4 of them. Love, there's also this word metta, which means loving kindness. And these are the qualities, they're timeless qualities that you cultivate, and they're so important. They're the utmost. So it's love, sympathetic joy, compassion, and empathy, and also there's a sense of equanimity. So all of these things are called divine abodes, and that it's through love and compassion. They're the 2 wings of Buddhism. One is love and one is wisdom. And so through love and compassion, that is why the Buddha taught, out of compassion, seeing other people suffering and wanting to help them. So this real central thing, and then also having wisdom about how suffering works.
Wasn't that causing him suffering, to see other people suffering, feel compassion?
Yeah, so this compassion, so he would see, when he saw people suffering, that was what sort of sparked it, right? Seeing them suffering and knowing he was going to suffer. And then there's this idea of equanimity, and this is what the Buddha taught, is that you cannot become so overwhelmed by all the suffering in the world that you need some strength. And so you have compassion, but you also have a certain kind of balance so that you can be prepared to help people who are suffering, to give them the teachings, to give them what they need to be able to flourish and so on. Yeah. Yes, there are a lot of them. You could kind of break them down largely into, there's this one tradition called Mahayana, it's called the Greater Vehicle. That's what we have in East Asia. So if you think of Zen, you think of Zen or Tibetan Buddhism, that follows a form called Mahayana. And then there's another tradition called Theravada, which means the way of the elders. That's what we have in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. They're more strict in their monastic practices. They also read scripture very literally. So the Mahayana tradition in East Asia, they say some of these teachings, maybe they don't fit. Maybe there isn't a central mountain in 4 continents, the world is not flat, those kinds of things. But the Theravada tradition is more committed to reading the scriptures more literally and doing a stricter form of monasticism. And then within that, there are all these different kinds of schools, so you have, Sri Lankan Buddhism as opposed to Burmese Buddhism, or Zen and Tibetan can seem very different. And then there's an esoteric tradition, which we may have heard of Tantra, so this sort of Tantric Buddhism that's practiced in Tibet, and that's like a whole it's very cool. You'll have to take my class. Well, I'll teach you guys about Tantra, but that's a whole nother, the idea was that the world has gotten so bad, we need to fast track our ways to enlightenment. What are some techniques we can do to get us to enlightenment faster through these kinds of magical practices in some ways, different kinds of chanting and so on. It's also very, really interesting philosophy behind it as well. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm trying to learn more about, being a historian. Wish I spent more time sort of in communities, but I know for example, I live in East Charlotte, and there's a nun who is ordained in Sri Lanka. She's actually a woman from Charlotte, but she got ordained in Sri Lanka, so she has a small little nunnery. So that is over in East Charlotte. But as you know, we have so many communities here from Asia. So in many ways, the different communities of migrants, we have a Cambodian temple and so on. So we have those kinds of communities that serve people who are raised in different Asian Buddhist traditions. And then you'll also see that there's what's called insight meditation or mindfulness or vipassana. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's very popular among people who are maybe they're not Buddhists themselves, but they want to learn a certain kind of meditation. So there's like an insight meditation center. And a lot of times those are people who maybe they work at Bank of America and on their lunch break will learn this kind of meditation practice. So that's a different kind of meditate. It's more of a meditation center. But if you go there, you'll see a Buddha statue and so on. Yeah, I'll be curious. We'll talk about maybe finding a temple to visit. I'd like to. There's a big one on Monroe Road, the True Buddha Temple. You've probably seen some of these. Have you driven by some of these? You'll see the different. One on Monroe Road is in the Chinese tradition. I've been trying to visit that. A lot of interesting artwork there.
Is the meditation and yoga the same thing?
They could be the same. I mean, the words for meditation and yoga in the tradition, of cultivating the mind and the body. Yoga, even though there are Buddhist yogas traditionally comes from Hinduism, and it was, doing the different postures to cultivate. Whereas meditation, which of course you have meditation in all sorts of religious traditions, but Buddhist meditation is focused on two things: calm and insight. So trying to calm your mind down, bringing some stillness, and then getting insight into how the world works, how your suffering works, and so on. All right, well, thank you guys so much. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. I hope you learned something. It's hard without a clock in here. I don't know how long I even went on for.
That was perfect.
Okay.
So much for coming. Thank all of you guys for coming, and we'll have a reception in the gathering space. And look for information from me on going to a temple. We're going to work on trying to find a good place to go where we can very respectfully go and interact with folks who are practicing Buddhism. And this is just a little part of us learning about our neighbors, right? So as we learn more about understanding our neighbors, they become less of the other, and we can be more in friendship with those around us. So thank you all for coming today, and thank you
Thanks,
so much,
guys.
Dr. K.